Olivia Martinez wiped the sweat from her brow as she scrubbed the marble floor of the Blackwood Mansion's grand foyer. The summer heat in Newport, Rhode Island, was unrelenting, and even the mansion's state-of-the-art air conditioning couldn't completely dispel the oppressive warmth. She had been working for the Blackwood family for just over a month, and still, the opulence of the place never ceased to amaze her. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their facets catching the sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Priceless artwork adorned walls covered in silk wallpaper, and antique furniture that probably cost more than Olivia would make in a lifetime was carefully arranged throughout the house. It was a far cry from the cramped apartment she shared with her mother and younger sister in the less affluent part of town. At 23, Olivia had taken the job as a maid to help support her family and save for college. The pay was good, and Mrs. Blackwood had been kind enough to hire her despite her lack of experience. Still, there was something about the sprawling mansion that made Olivia uneasy. Perhaps it was the way Mr. Blackwood's eyes seemed to follow her as she worked, or the hushed conversations that abruptly ceased whenever she entered a room. As she finished polishing the last of the marble tiles, Olivia heard the click of heels on hardwood. She looked up to see Mrs. Blackwood descending the grand staircase, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit despite the heat. "Olivia, dear," Mrs. Blackwood called, her voice syrupy sweet. "When you're finished here, I need you to clean the guest rooms on the third floor. We're having some very important visitors this weekend, and everything must be perfect." "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood," Olivia replied, rising to her feet. "I'll get right on it." Mrs. Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Excellent. Oh, and remember, the east wing of the third floor is strictly off limits. Mr. Blackwood's study is there, and he values his privacy." Olivia nodded, suppressing a shiver despite the warmth. It wasn't the first time she'd been warned about the East Wing, and each reminder only piqued her curiosity further. What could Mr. Blackwood possibly be hiding that required such secrecy? As Mrs. Blackwood clicked her way toward the kitchen, Olivia gathered her cleaning supplies and headed for the elevator. The Blackwoods spared no expense, even for their staff, and Olivia was grateful she didn't have to lug her heavy bucket up 3 flights of stairs. The third floor was quieter than the rest of the house, the thick carpets muffling her footsteps as she made her way down the hallway. She worked methodically, cleaning each guest room with care. As she dusted, vacuumed, and changed linens, Olivia's mind wandered to her family. Her mother would be starting her shift at the diner soon, and her sister Elena would be home from summer school. Olivia wished she could be there to help Elena with her homework, but the overtime pay from this job would go a long way toward buying new school supplies in the fall. Lost in thought, Olivia almost didn't notice when she reached the end of the hallway. She froze, realizing she stood at the threshold of the forbidden East Wing. A heavy oak door marked the entrance, its brass handle gleaming in the soft light from the wall sconces. Olivia knew she should turn back. Mrs. Blackwood's warning echoed in her mind, along with the potential consequences of disobeying. She could lose this job, and with it, her family's financial lifeline. And yet, something about that closed door called to her. The air seemed different here, heavier somehow, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Before she could talk herself out of it, Olivia's hand was on the doorknob, turning it slowly. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. The door swung open silently, revealing a dimly lit corridor. The air that rushed out was cool and musty, carrying a faint, unidentifiable scent. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she took a tentative step forward. The East Wing was nothing like the rest of the house. Gone were the priceless antiques and cheery wallpaper. Instead, dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the carpet beneath her feet was a deep, rich red. Doors lined either side of the hallway, each one closed and unmarked. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she heard a sound, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from behind one of the doors, a soft whimpering that raised the hair on the back of her neck. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to pretend she had never set foot in this forbidden place. But that sound, it tugged at her heart, compelling her forward. With trembling fingers, Olivia reached for the handle of the door where the sound originated. As she turned it, the whimpering grew louder, more desperate. The door creaked open, and Olivia gasped. Olivia's eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light as she stepped into the room. The air was thick and stale, carrying a metallic scent that made her stomach churn. As her vision cleared, the full horror of what lay before her came into focus. The room was spartanly furnished, with bare concrete walls and a single flickering fluorescent light overhead. But it wasn't the decor that made Olivia's blood run cold. It was the row of cages lining the far wall, each barely large enough to hold a human body. And they weren't empty. In the nearest cage, a young woman huddled in the corner, her thin frame shaking with silent sobs. Her once blonde hair was matted and dirty, and bruises mottled her pale skin. As Olivia's gaze swept across the room, she saw that two other cages were occupied, one by a teenage boy who couldn't have been more than 16, and another by a woman who appeared to be of Middle Eastern descent. Olivia's mind reeled, unable to process the scene before her. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in America, not in the 21st century, and certainly not in the manicured mansions of Newport's elite. The whimpering she had heard grew louder, and Olivia realized it was coming from the blonde woman. Swallowing her fear, she approached the cage. "Hey," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me? What's your name?" The woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. She scrambled back, pressing herself against the far side of the cage. "Please," the woman croaked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Please don't hurt me. I'll be good, I promise." Olivia's heart shattered. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, crouching down to appear less threatening. "My name is Olivia. I work here as a maid. I want to help you." The woman stared at her, disbelief warring with hope in her sunken eyes. "Help?" she repeated, as if the word was foreign to her. "Yes," Olivia nodded, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What's your name?" "Sarah," the woman whispered after a long pause. "My name is Sarah." From another cage, the teenage boy spoke up. "Are you really here to help us?" His voice cracked, a mix of fear and desperate hope. Olivia turned to him, her mind racing. What could she do? She was just a maid, with no power, no influence. But she couldn't walk away from this. "Yes," she said firmly, surprising herself with her resolve. "I'm going to get you out of here." The Middle Eastern woman stirred in her cage. "Many have promised," she said bitterly. "None have succeeded. He is too powerful." "Who?" Olivia asked, though she already knew the answer. "Blackwood!" Sarah spat the name like a curse. "He calls this his collection. Says we should be honored to be chosen." Bile rose in Olivia's throat. She had known something was off about her employer, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. A sudden noise from the hallway made them all freeze. Footsteps growing closer. "You have to go," Sarah hissed urgently. "If he catches you here, you'll end up like us, or worse." Olivia hesitated, torn between the need to flee and the desire to help. "I'll come back," she promised. "I'll find a way to free you." "Just go," the boy pleaded. Heart pounding, Olivia slipped out of the room, easing the door shut behind her. She had barely made it back to the main part of the third floor when she heard a deep voice that made her blood run cold. "Olivia, what are you doing up here?" She turned slowly to face Mr. Blackwood, plastering what she hoped was a neutral expression on her face. "Just finishing up the guest room, sir," she managed to say, gesturing to her cleaning cart. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, studying her intently. "I see. Well, I believe Mrs. Blackwood told you the East Wing was off limits, didn't she?" Olivia nodded, praying he couldn't hear the frantic beating of her heart. "Yes, sir. I was just about to head back downstairs." He stared at her for a long moment, and Olivia felt as if he could see right through her, reading the horror and revulsion she was desperately trying to conceal. Finally, he smiled, but it was a cold thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Very good. Run along then. And Olivia, remember, curiosity killed the cat." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Olivia mumbled a response and hurried to the elevator, feeling Blackwood's gaze boring into her back the entire way. As the elevator descended, Olivia's mind raced. She had stumbled upon something monstrous, something that defied belief. And now the lives of those captives, and quite possibly her own, hung in the balance. She knew she should run, quit her job, and never look back. But the faces of Sarah, the boy, and the other woman haunted her. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. Olivia's hands shook as she pulled her phone from her pocket, ducking into a secluded alcove near the servants' entrance. Her mind raced, trying to process the horrors she had witnessed and formulate a plan. She knew she had to act fast. Every moment those people remained captive was another moment of suffering. Just as she was about to dial 911, a gentle hand touched her shoulder. Olivia jumped, nearly dropping her phone. "Whoa, easy there," said a familiar voice. It was Marcus, the Blackwood's groundskeeper. In his mid-30s, with kind eyes and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, Marcus had been one of the few friendly faces Olivia had encountered since starting her job. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Marcus said, concern etching his features. "Everything okay?" Olivia hesitated. Could she trust Marcus? She barely knew him, but something in his eyes made her want to confide in him. Taking a deep breath, she made a split-second decision. "Marcus, I saw something terrible, in the East Wing." The color drained from Marcus's face. He glanced around quickly, then pulled Olivia further into the alcove. "Keep your voice down," he whispered urgently. "These walls have ears." "You know," Olivia gasped, a mix of relief and horror washing over her. "About the people in the cages?" Marcus nodded grimly. "I've known for a while. Been trying to figure out a way to help them. But Blackwood, he's not just some rich guy playing at being a villain. He's connected, powerful in ways you can't imagine." Olivia's heart sank. "So calling the police would be suicide," Marcus finished. "For us and for them. The local cops are in Blackwood's pocket. State police too, probably. We need to be smart about this." Olivia leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling the weight of the situation crushing down on her. "What can we do? We can't just leave them there." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. "Nods. I've been gathering evidence, trying to build a case that even Blackwood can't wriggle out of, but it's slow going. One wrong move and we're all dead." A thought struck Olivia. "Well, what about the FBI? Surely Blackwood can't have corrupted them too?" "It's risky," Marcus mused. "But you might be onto something. I have a contact, an old army buddy who works for the Bureau now. If we can get solid evidence to him, he might be able to help." Hope flared in Olivia's chest. "So what's our next move?" Marcus checked his watch. "For now, you need to act normal. Go about your duties like nothing's wrong. Blackwood's suspicious by nature. If he senses something's off, he'll clam up tight, and we'll lose any chance we have." Olivia nodded, trying to steady her nerves. "And then?" "Meet me tonight after your shift. There's an old boathouse down by the water, about a quarter-mile south of the property. Midnight. We'll make a plan." As Marcus turned to leave, Olivia caught his arm. "Why are you helping? Why risk everything for people you don't even know?" Marcus's eyes clouded, with a pain Olivia couldn't quite understand. "Let's just say I've seen what men like Blackwood can do. Never again. Not if I can help it." With that, he was gone, leaving Olivia alone with her thoughts and the monumental task ahead. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Olivia went through the motions of her work, dusting and polishing on autopilot, while her mind whirled with plans and fears. Every time she passed Mr. or Mrs. Blackwood, her heart raced, certain they could see her newfound knowledge written plainly on her face. As night fell, the mansion came alive with the sounds of a dinner party. The Blackwoods' important guests had arrived, a mix of politicians, business tycoons, and old money elites. Olivia couldn't help but wonder how many of them knew about the horrors lurking just a few floors above. She served canapes with trembling hands, forcing smiles as the wealthy and powerful laughed and schmoozed. One guest, a silver-haired senator with a too-wide smile, let his hand linger a bit too long as he took a glass of champagne from her tray. Olivia suppressed a shudder, wondering if he too was part of Blackwood's twisted world. Finally, mercifully, her shift ended. Olivia changed out of her uniform in record time, her pulse quickening as she slipped out the back door and into the warm summer night. The path to the boathouse was dark and overgrown, clearly unused for years. Olivia picked her way carefully along the shore, the gentle lapping of waves against the rocks providing cover for any errant twigs she might snap underfoot. As she approached the dilapidated structure, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Marcus emerged from the shadows, motioning her inside. The interior of the boathouse was musty and cramped, lit only by a small, battery-powered lantern. Marcus had set up a makeshift command center, a folding table covered in maps, documents, and a laptop. "Glad you made it," he said, his voice low. "We don't have much time. Blackwood's planning something big, and we need to move fast if we're going to stop him." Olivia leaned in, studying the documents spread before them. "What kind of something big?" Marcus's face was grim in the lantern light. "Remember those VIP guests? They're not just here for a social call. Blackwood's hosting an auction tomorrow night. And the merchandise—" He trailed off, but Olivia understood. Horror and determination warred within her. "Then we have less than 24 hours to save them." Marcus nodded, pulling up a blueprint of the mansion on his laptop. Here's what we're going to do. As they huddled over the plans, neither of them noticed the small, blinking light of a hidden camera capturing their every move. In his study, Mr. Blackwood watched the feed with growing interest, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well, well, he murmured. Isn't this an interesting development? The game was on, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to touch the horizon as Olivia crept back into the Blackwood mansion. Her mind was reeling from the night's planning session with Marcus, their desperate scheme feeling simultaneously like her only hope and a suicide mission. As she tiptoed through the kitchen to change into her uniform, Olivia nearly collided with Mrs. Blackwood. The older woman was impeccably dressed despite the early hour, her eyes sharp and calculating. My, you're here early, Olivia, Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Eager to start the day? Olivia's heart hammered in her chest, but she managed a weak smile. Yes, ma'am. Lots to do before tonight's event. Something flickered in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes, suspicion, perhaps, or a cruel amusement. Indeed. Well, don't let me keep you. And Olivia, do be careful today. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to you. As Mrs. Blackwood glided away, Olivia leaned against the counter, trying to steady her breathing. The threat had been clear, even if veiled in politeness. They knew. Somehow they knew. The day passed in a haze of tension and barely concealed panic. Olivia went about her duties mechanically, all the while looking for opportunities to implement the plan she and Marcus had devised. Their strategy was risky, built on a foundation of desperation and limited resources. Marcus would create a distraction, a small, controlled fire in the groundskeeper's shed, while Olivia used the ensuing chaos to slip into the east wing and free the captives. They would escape through a series of old smugglers' tunnels Marcus had discovered beneath the property, emerging near the coast, where a boat would be waiting to take them to safety. It was far from foolproof, but it was all they had. As evening approached, the mansion buzzed with activity. Caterers and staff bustled about, preparing for the night's sinister gathering. Olivia's stomach turned as she overheard snippets of conversation from the arriving guests, coded words and veiled references that took on a horrifying new meaning now that she knew the truth. At precisely 9:45 p.m., a muffled explosion rocked the property. Shouts of alarm filled the air as smoke began to billow from the direction of the groundskeeper's shed. It was time. In the ensuing pandemonium, Olivia slipped away from the other staff and made her way to the third floor. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure someone would hear it as she crept down the hallway towards the east wing. To her shock, the door was ajar. Olivia hesitated, every instinct screaming that this was a trap. But the faces of Sarah and the others flashed in her mind, spurring her forward. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. As she entered the dim corridor, a voice froze her in her tracks. "We've been expecting you, Olivia." Mr. Blackwood stepped out of the shadows, flanked by two burly men she didn't recognize. Behind them, she could see into the room where the cages had been, but it was empty now. No sign of Sarah or the others. "Where are they?" Olivia demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. Blackwood's smile was cold and predatory. "Oh, they've been moved to a more secure location. Can't have the merchandise wandering off before the big sale, can we?" "You won't get away with this," Olivia said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "My dear, I've been getting away with this for longer than you've been alive. Did you really think a maid and a washed-up soldier could bring down an empire?" As if on cue, the door behind her opened. Olivia's heart sank as she saw Marcus being shoved into the room, his face bruised and bloodied. "I'm sorry, Liv," he mumbled. They were waiting for me." Blackwood clapped his hands together, looking for all the world like a pleased school teacher. "Well, now that we're all here, why don't we have a little chat about consequences?" Olivia's mind raced, searching desperately for a way out. But as Blackwood's men advanced on her and Marcus, she realized with growing horror that their half-baked plan had failed before it even truly began. The auction would proceed as planned. Sarah and the others would be sold off to the highest bidders. And she and Marcus. Olivia shuddered to think what fate awaited them. But as Blackwood began to monologue about power and the natural order of things, Olivia caught Marcus's eye. There was a glint there, a tiny spark of defiance that hadn't been extinguished. And she realized this wasn't over. Not yet. They had underestimated Blackwood's reach and ruthlessness. But Blackwood, in his arrogance, might just be underestimating them as well. As the men grabbed her arms, Olivia allowed herself to be led away. Her body might be captured, but her mind was already working, formulating a new plan. Somehow, some way, she would find a way to turn the tables. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. Olivia's wrists chafed against the zip ties binding her to the chair. She and Marcus had been unceremoniously dumped in what appeared to be a wine cellar deep beneath the Blackwood mansion. The air was damp and musty, heavy with the scent of aged oak and desperation. "I'm sorry, Olivia," Marcus said, his voice rough with pain and regret. "I should have been more careful, should have known they'd be watching us." Olivia shook her head, wincing as the movement sent a spike of pain through her temple where one of Blackwood's goons had struck her. "It's not your fault. We both underestimated them." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of activity from above. The auction was beginning. Olivia's mind raced, grasping for any shred of hope. "Your FBI contact?" she said suddenly. "Is there any chance he might come looking for you?" Marcus's face fell. "I never got the chance to contact him. Blackwood's men grabbed me before I could make the call." Hope flickered and died in Olivia's chest. They were truly on their own. Suddenly, the cellar door creaked open. Mrs. Blackwood descended the stairs, her heels clicking ominously on the stone floor. She regarded her prisoners with a mixture of disdain and amusement. "My husband thought you might like a front row seat to tonight's proceedings," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She produced a tablet from behind her back, setting it on a nearby wine barrel. "Wouldn't want you to miss all the excitement." With a cruel smile, she tapped the screen. A video feed flickered to life, showing an opulently decorated ballroom filled with well-dressed men and women. At the front of the room stood Mr. Blackwood, looking every inch the gracious host. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang out, slightly tinny through the tablet speakers, "welcome to our exclusive event. Tonight we offer you the rarest of commodities: youth, beauty, and absolute obedience." Olivia's stomach churned as Sarah was led onto a raised platform, her eyes vacant and movements jerky, clearly drugged. The bidding began, numbers flying higher and higher, as the wealthy elite vied for ownership of a human being. "Stop it," Olivia pleaded, turning to Mrs. Blackwood. "How can you be part of this? They're people, not property." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes hardened. "Oh, you naive little thing. This is the way the world truly works. The strong prey on the weak. The rich control the poor. We're simply being honest about it." As Sarah was led away and the next lot was brought out, Olivia felt something inside her snap. Rage, pure and white hot, coursed through her veins. She had been afraid, yes, but now? Now she was angry. "You won't get away with this," she growled, straining against her bonds. "Someone will stop you." Mrs. Blackwood laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "And who might that be? You? Your bumbling friend here? Face it, dear, you've lost." As she turned to leave, Olivia called out, "Why are you showing us this? Why not just kill us and be done with it?" Mrs. Blackwood paused at the foot of the stairs. "Consider it a lesson in futility. And besides," she added with a cruel smirk, "my husband has special plans for you two once the auction is over. Waste not, want not, after all." The cellar door slammed shut, leaving Olivia and Marcus alone with the sounds of the ongoing auction. "We have to do something," Olivia said, renewing her struggles against the zip ties. "We can't just sit here while they—" "Olivia," Marcus interrupted, his voice oddly calm. "Look at me." She turned, ready to snap at him for giving up, but the words died in her throat. There was a glint in Marcus's eye, a tiny spark of— was that hope? "Remember when I said I was gathering evidence?" he said quietly. "Well, I might have left out a few details, like the fact that I managed to plant a few bugs around the mansion, bugs that have been transmitting everything, including tonight's little soiree, to a secure server." Olivia's eyes widened. "But you said—" "I know what I said," Marcus cut her off. "Couldn't risk the Blackwoods overhearing if they were listening in, but the truth is, help might be closer than they realize." As if on cue, a distant commotion could be heard from above. Shouts, the sound of breaking glass, and then, gloriously, the unmistakable wail of police sirens. "Cavalry's here," Marcus said with a grim smile. "Now, let's see if we can get ourselves free and join the party, shall we?" As the sounds of chaos grew louder overhead, Olivia felt a surge of fierce determination. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The Blackwood's reign of terror was coming to an end, and Olivia intended to be there to see it fall. The cellar erupted into a flurry of activity as Olivia and Marcus worked frantically to free themselves. The zip ties bit into their wrists, but adrenaline dulled the pain as they twisted and strained against their bonds. Come on, Olivia muttered through gritted teeth. Above them, the sounds of chaos grew louder, shouting, running footsteps, and the splintering of wood. With a final desperate yank, Marcus's zip tie snapped. He quickly freed Olivia, and they both stumbled to their feet, muscles protesting after hours of forced immobility. We need to get up there, Olivia said, her voice hoarse but determined. We have to make sure Sarah and the others are safe. Marcus nodded, already moving towards the cellar door. It was locked, of course, but the old wood was no match for their combined desperation. With a series of powerful kicks, the door frame splintered, and they burst into the hallway beyond. The scene that greeted them was one of utter pandemonium. FBI agents in tactical gear swarmed the mansion, their shouts echoing off marble floors and vaulted ceilings. The well-heeled auction attendees were being rounded up, some protesting loudly about their rights and connections, others simply looking shell-shocked. Olivia and Marcus pushed their way through the chaos, searching desperately for any sign of Sarah or the other captives. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with Mr. Blackwood himself, flanked by two burly bodyguards. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Blackwood's face contorted with rage, all pretense of civility stripped away. You, he snarled, lunging forward. But before he could reach them, a voice rang out. FBI, freeze! A team of agents swarmed in, weapons drawn. Blackwood's bodyguards raised their hands, but Blackwood himself seemed beyond reason. With a roar of fury, he charged at Olivia. Time slowed to a crawl. Olivia saw the madness in Blackwood's eyes, the spittle flying from his lips as he bore down on her. She braced herself for impact, but at the last second, Marcus shoved her aside, taking the full brunt of Blackwood's assault. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, grappling furiously. Agents rushed in to separate them, but not before Marcus landed a solid right hook, snapping Blackwood's head back with a satisfying crack. As Blackwood was hauled away in handcuffs, spitting threats and promises of revenge, Olivia helped Marcus to his feet. Are you okay? She asked, noting the fresh bruises blooming on his face. Marcus managed a pained smile. Never better. Come on, let's find the others. They made their way through the mansion, directed by FBI agents, to a secure room where the rescued captives were being tended to by medical personnel. Olivia's heart leapt as she saw Sarah wrapped in a shock blanket, but very much alive. You came back, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper as Olivia approached. You actually came back for us. Olivia took Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. I made a promise, didn't I? Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she pulled Olivia into a fierce hug. Around them, similar scenes of relief and reunion played out as the other captives were comforted and cared for. As the night wore on, Olivia and Marcus found themselves seated in the back of an ambulance, being checked over by paramedics. An FBI agent, Marcus's old army buddy, as it turned out, approached them. You two took one hell of a risk, the agent said, shaking his head. But thanks to the evidence Marcus gathered, we've got Blackwood and his entire network dead to rights. Human trafficking, racketeering, corruption. The list goes on. They're going away for a long, long time. Olivia let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for days. What about the victims? What happens to them now? The agent's expression softened. They'll get the help they need. Medical care, counseling, protection if necessary. It's a long road ahead, but they're safe now. Thanks in no small part to you two. As the agent walked away, Olivia turned to Marcus. So what happens to us now? Marcus chuckled, wincing slightly at the pain in his ribs. Well, I don't know about you, but I could use a vacation. Somewhere far, far away from any mansions or secret rooms. Olivia laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. That sounds perfect. As the sun began to rise over Newport, casting a golden glow across the turbulent scene, Olivia reflected on the whirlwind of events that had brought her to this moment. She had come to the Blackwood mansion looking for a job, a way to support her family and save for college. Instead, she had found a nightmare, but also the strength and courage she never knew she possessed. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be statements to give, trials to attend, and no doubt sleepless nights haunted by the horrors she had witnessed. But as she watched Sarah and the other survivors being gently led to waiting vehicles, Olivia knew that every hardship had been worth it. She had made a difference. She had kept her promise. And in doing so, she had helped bring down an empire of cruelty and exploitation. As she and Marcus were finally cleared to leave, Olivia took one last look at the Blackwood mansion. Its imposing facade now seemed diminished somehow, its dark secrets dragged into the light of day. "Ready to go?" Marcus asked, offering her a hand. Olivia nodded, taking his hand and stepping into the bright morning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same determination and courage that had seen her through this ordeal. The nightmare was over. A new day had dawned, and Olivia was ready to face it head on.